Oh.
Greeterlings, my name is Jordan and I talk about the lore and history of various things that interest me. So, vampires. Be they pretty, be they spooky, be they in dire need of therapy. They're all pretty neat in all their own little special messed up ways. There is something strangely alluring about these bloodthirsty creatures of the night, which is capitalized oh so much on by the absolutely redonkulous amounts of media and fiction starring the bitey buggers. And perhaps one of the more well known of these is World of Darkness, with their roleplay gameplay hits like Vampire the Masquerade, Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, Vampire the Masquerade Swansong, Vampire the Masquerade Bloodhunt, and of course who can forget Vampire the Masquerade Hotel Trivago. However, the thing that sets them apart from most others of the genre is that in The Masquerade, the vampires aren't some sort of final boss behind a legion of ghouls, or trying their hardest to distance themselves from 20-something girls in as attractively ineffective a way as possible, but they're the actual protagonists of the game. You play as one, and it expands more upon their humanity, or often their tenuous relationship with it, rather than all the bad voodoo they can do, at least for the most part. But where did tonight's gang of ghastly goths come from? Well, let's talk a bit about their lore and find out tonight. Right, so first of all let's get some of the basics out of the way before we get into the history proper. For the most part they're pretty much what you expect a vampire to be like. They need to drink blood to survive, which they use for all sorts of things from regenerating, using crazy magic powers, or just being able to actually move and stuff. And if they ever run out, they basically drop on the spot like a toy with depleted batteries and enter a slumber known as torpor, until someone makes them wake up by giving them their due sippies. They have the standard kinds of vampire powers like superhuman strength and speed, but depending on what clan you belong to, we'll get to those later, you could also turn invisible, mind control others, or do all the other things you'd come to expect from these nocturnal narcissists. Garlic, silver and crucifixes generally don't really do jack against them, but sunlight, fire or just large amounts of physical damage will do them in real good. Getting staked doesn't immediately kill them, but rather paralyzes them until it is removed, though this is obviously still very bad news since they're very vulnerable in this state and could be easily disposed of for realsies. Oh yeah, and then you also have this thing called the Beast, which is kind of the typical "no baby, I can't be with you, I am a killer and I'll only risk hurting you" type of affair. Being a bloodthirsty hunter of the night obviously puts them at odds with the human they used to be, so they need to maintain a constant balancing act between their humanity and just going full out flip out spanky wanky and ripping everyone a new one, which understandably can get one into trouble. Oh yes, and then also some vampire lingo because they're nothing if not a pretentious bunch. Kindred is the vampire word for, well, vampire, which I'll be using interchangeably in order to make sure you're still paying attention. The embrace is the act of turning a Yumi into a Kindred. A Saya is the person who turned said Yumi to Kindred. A child, or childer if there are multiple, are the Yumis who are turned into Kindred by the sire. Basically think of the sire as your vampire poppy or mommy, and of a child as well a child. Got that? Good. So now that we've put down the basics, let's get into the history and why they're even a thing in the first place. So once upon a ye olden time, there was this fella you might have heard of called Caine. One day, Caine and his bestest brother Abel were making sacrifices to the big G up above. Caine gave as an offering the finest salads he could procure, and Abel gifted a full steakhouse deluxe meal with barbecue sauce and fried chicken fingers. Needless to say, Big G liked Abel a lot more. This pissed Caine off to no end, but he decided that instead of sulking and moping about it, he would take a proactive role in solving the situation. And you know what? Good on him! I think that's a good, positive mindset to have, and when it promotes growth in a person instead of wallowing in their misery. Unfortunately, in this case, this meant twatting Abel on the head with a rock so hard he died. Now on the bright side, the issue of Abel winning these competitions to get Big G's affection was no longer a competition, but only because it made him like Caine a lot less real quick. So, as a punishment, he decided to give Caine the old cursory-do, and he was damned to walk the earth, undying, until the end of time. So he did that for a while, and being pretty depressed about it the whole time, until one day Big G got a bit sick of him constantly bringing the mood down on this new planet he was trying to create, and he zapped down some angels to offer him his very own redemption arc. Caine, who is nothing if not proactive in making terrible life choices, rejected them 3 times. And was given another additional curse with every single one, just to show how committed Big G really was to helping him. He was made to fear the flame, be weak to sunlight, and have to drink blood in order to survive. This effectively turned him into the first ever vampire, which didn't particularly improve his mood, but it also managed to give him superpowers somehow, so... So Caine continued wandering around for a while, until he eventually managed to stumble upon the first city, of which he was immediately made the new king, since everyone probably agreed that it was in their best interests to try and please the depressed immortal bear of a man that just stumbled in one day. Now the king of the first city, Caine would enjoy his position for a while, until he once more got a bit depressed about the fact that he was going to have to spend all eternity by his lonesome, sad self. Luckily, the former king, Enoch, had just the solution to Caine's troubles. Turn him into a vampire as well. Being racked by loneliness and being constantly egged on by Enoch, Caine eventually decided to accept and gave Mr. Enoch one fresh embrace of the press. But the problem wasn't necessarily fixed, as now you had two antisocial depressed loners hanging about the place, kinda enjoying their immortality but also not really. So Enoch would step up to Daddy again and ask him for some playmates. And once again Caine decided to accept and gave two others the old embrace as well. These would be Irat, who became an absolute monster in battle and was able to juggle the ancient Bronze Age equivalent of dumpsters, and Zyla, who Caine had the hots for. His criteria for embracing wasn't the most strict thing in the world at this time. But Caine's constant weeping and being depressed somehow didn't make for the greatest potential suitor, and he was repeatedly turned down by Zilla. Though, credit where credit is due, Caine wouldn't sit and cry about it. He would seek to improve his chances as best he could through whatever means were necessary. And you know, I think that's a very good mindset to have. Instead of sulking about rejection, I think it's a good idea to re-examine oneself and realize that perhaps there are some aspects in which you might have to improve. So he would contact this totally trustworthy witch with totally no ulterior motives, known as the Crone, who promised to help Caine find a way to control Zilla. Oh god damn it. But basically she'd help him with his fetishes in return for getting embraced as well, as he was basically tossing them around to whoever helped him feel less shit about himself. He accepted, and the Crone would tell him about this nifty little thing vampires could do called a blood bond, where you can basically enslave another vampire to your will by having them drink your blood. Now, I don't know how this random witch knew more about vampires than Caine did, but the big man probably didn't get to think about it much since he was immediately blood bonded by the Crone, who maybe hoped that mind control would make him stop whining for 5 minutes. So for 1 year and 1 day, Caine would be the Crone's pretty widow puppet, being forced to do her bidding and obey her every whim. However, despite somehow knowing about blood bonding while there were only like 4 vampires in existence at this point, she apparently didn't know that if you didn't give your blood bond victim the occasional sippy of blood, the mind control would fade after a while. Which it did. But for once, Caine actually decided to use that head of his, and, pretending to still be blood bonded, would ever so inconspicuously ask the Crone about how to best dispose of other kindred. The Crone once again showcased a rather suspicious amount of knowledge about kindred, and explained to Caine how staking works, which Caine then immediately turned around on her by shanking her with a sharp piece of wood and leaving her out for the sun to dry. Youch. But while all this enslaving and stabbing business was going on, those sneaky vampy scamps had themselves embraced several others, who became known as the Third Generation. And they actually had a pretty good thing going for a while. The first city became a true city of the night, where vampires were in charge and everyone else toiled underneath their mighty tread. Didn't last long though, since Caine didn't even have time to come back home properly and take off his shoes, or the Big G got a bit uppity again and decided to flood the entire world. But Big G must have been high or something that day, because he apparently mixed up his elemental weaknesses and he forgot that while kindred were weak to fire, they most definitely were not to water. So while the first city was completely trashed and most Yumis got promptly drowned, plenty of kindred actually managed to survive it pretty well, and we managed to immediately get back to building the, I kid you not, second city. Caine, seeing the city he had spent decades, if not centuries, ruling and developing get completely stomped, decided that he was kinda done with this world's nonsense and he'd just go and chill out in a dark cave by himself being sad somewhere. Several times his childer and grandchilder tried to retrieve their new deadbeat dad, and several times he'd tell them to piss off and leave him alone, which, as you can't really argue with Caine, they would eventually do. And I mean, hey, credit to them, as it only took them like 10 minutes without daddy's oversight for things to go completely to crap. The survivors of the Third Generation would almost immediately usurp and wipe out their sires, with the 13 traitorous ticks that took charge charge, becoming known as the Antideluvians, with each going on to found their very own clan. Now, a vampire clan is a bit like a class in an RPG or MMORPG. You get access to several neat abilities and perks, as well as, because Caine wasn't particularly pleased with his kiddos murdering each other and decided to take a page out of Big G's book, a curse. The clan you're a part of depends on what clan your sire belonged to. You're a part of the same clan as your sire, and whatever poor fool you embrace will be part of that clan in turn. Simple as that. And these clans are kind of a big deal. While some might be nothing more to a kindred than their specific flavor of magic they can use, others might be fully organized and have an entire hierarchy contained within. And the clans are quite a cut apart from one another as well. Take for example the terrifying Nosferatu, whose curse makes them all look like the back of a bus had a child with a melted figurine of Batman, but who excel in espionage due to their abilities to control animals and go invisible. Also, they're objectively the best clan, and it has nothing to do with the fact that they're my favorite. And then compare that to the eccentric Toreador, who are like the typical Hollywood hot guy, gal type vampire, whose curse makes them obsessed with beautiful things, and who are a master of blending in with humans due to their wicked charms and hot looks. Fair to say the two clans don't get along much. So, having explained this, it is probably no surprise to say that the Antediluvian government didn't hold up for very long either. Fighting and infighting between clans would quickly cause things to spiral out of control and for the second city to be completely crashed in no time. This time without Big G's involvement, so progress I guess. After this whole clusterclug, the kindred would scatter and settle all over the globe, some forming little communities attached to human settlements like parasites, some simply wandering by their lonesome or in small tight-knit groups. From here on out, kindred would develop alongside human society and, outside of some Inquisition business, an uprising, and a fair share of war and political backstabbery that I don't have the time to talk about this moment, this brings us into modern nights. Get it? Because vampires, they live in the dark, so instead of the modern day, it's the modern night. So what are they up to these days? Well, as it turns out, those mobs of villagers with pitchforks and torches are actually pretty scary now that they got AR-15s and nuclear weapons and stuff. So in order to protect itself, Vampire Society has put something in place called the Masquerade. As the name implies, the Masquerade is basically a loose set of rules or laws that are meant to hide and conceal the existence of vampires to the common masses. It forbids things like openly using your crazy magic powers, nibbling on some Neckies in public, or leaving any obvious evidence of the supernatural just lying around. Breaking these rules is often punishable by death, both for the vampire who broke the masquerade and whatever poor fellow got a bit too wise because of them. And fun fact, there isn't really such a thing as a vampiric legal system. So if you're found guilty of a major hiccup, whatever the person in charge of you decides will be your verdict. So best to make sure things don't get to that point. This also leads us to who is actually in charge these days. Over the long time that Kindred have been a thing, 3 major factions have formed, which, just like back in ye olden days, are constantly feuding and fighting amongst one another. First up on the chopping block are the Camarilla, who one can perhaps see as the most organized and civilized of the groups. They seek to maintain the status quo through a very strict and very old-fashioned hierarchy, read pyramid scheme, that sees a few rich elders at the top and everyone else below them fighting each other for the privilege of licking the sweat of their withered ass cheeks. They are by far the most fervent supporters of the Masquerade, and even go as far as to deny the existence of the Antideluvians or Caine to their membership for fear of these big fish potentially upsetting their positions of power. Our second contender are the Anarchs. Unlike what their name may imply, however, they are actually perfectly chill with the Masquerade and keeping things from getting too out of hand. They do, however, hate the very old boys hierarchy the Camarilla have going on, and are definitely allergic to their constant politicking and bickering. This obviously makes them a bit less organized, but this is by design, as they enjoy their freedom and don't want to spend literal eternity being chained down by some outdated system. And last but certainly not least, you have the Sabbats, who are pretty much just vampire supremacists, and more like a loose collection of different smaller factions and ideologies, all united in their purpose to stick it to the Camarilla and their dumb rules. Vampires rule, Yumis drool. The weak must fear the strong, and if you want to be in power, you won't get it through backroom talks, but by walking up to whoever is in charge and bashing their head in with a rock just like Daddy Caine intended. Their survival is, like most kindred, heavily dependent on the Masquerade, but they don't necessarily respect it or even want it to be that way. If it was up to them, kindred would still have their feet planted firmly on the mortals just like in the good old days. After 9/11. Oh, and Caine is around as well, somewhere, but you don't want to meet him as he is basically the strongest being on the planet. And if you want to know what it's like to face off against him, maybe watch One Punch Man and that's how well that goes. There's a reason why Caine's profile just had a big "you lose, dumbass" written where his stats would be. So, have fun with that. And that's basically all you gotta know for now. If you liked this little crash course of everyone's favorite neck nibbling knobheads, maybe consider liking and subscribing. If you have any topic you want me to talk about next, be it related to this or something else, or maybe you just want to actually me, you can let me know in the comments below. My socials are linked in the description. I hope you spent the day sucking people dry or doing something else that makes you happy, and bye bye. Just to show how committed Big G really... Fuck.